Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here at TreadAthletics.com. Today I want to touch on a little bit of a different topic. It's something that I have a lot of personal experience going through myself in my own playing career. 8 elbow surgery rehab mistakes. I've made most of these mistakes myself, but as a coach, as a company through Tread Athletics that works with hundreds and hundreds of athletes at the highest levels, we see a lot of the same mistakes over and over again. So quick disclaimer, I'm not a therapist. This is not medical advice. But we still work with a lot of athletes who are going through these rehab processes with their therapists, and we're programming their lifting, their throwing, a lot of their return to throwing programs as well, their mobility work, etc. So we see a lot of this stuff firsthand. And again, I just want to give some general advice kind of from my perspective. So take that for what it's worth. My personal experience, I've had 2 elbow surgeries. I've had a UCL Primary Repair in 2017. Then I also had a elbow scope this past year for a bone spur and a plica removal of my elbow as well. I also had an ulnar nerve transposition as part of my UCL surgery in 2017. So let's dive into it. Again, these are kind of 8 mistakes that I see. There's actually a bunch more than this, but these are the top ones. The first mistake is not using this rehab as a chance to overhaul any other limiting factors. So I've seen athletes where they have an injury, they require surgery, and they just kind of get really down on themselves, get really depressed, and see that as like, oh, it's a wasted year if it's Tommy John, or oh, it's a wasted 5-6 months if it's a primary repair, versus looking at it as an opportunity to take a step back, reevaluate themselves as a pitcher, reevaluate what are my weak links, where can I be improving, and looking at it from that lens, that perspective. So again, you have been forced to take a step back if you're a player watching this and you've gone through a surgery, but these are times to attack other mobility issues, be able to spend more time on other issues that are holding you back. Maybe it is a strength limit, maybe it's a lower body strength or conditioning component that you can really spend some more time on. Maybe it's learning more about the mental game, more about the psychological side of baseball and your approach, and what you can do differently from there when you do get healthy. So again, it can be a blessing in disguise, and I really would say that your attitude actually has a pretty big influence over the outcome of this surgery. You're going to be applying yourself more to the rehab process if you approach it with a good attitude, and you're going to be able to do that by finding other factors that you can still be working, still be improving on, especially in the kind of early phase of the rehab where it's quite frankly a little bit boring. The second mistake kind of goes hand in hand with the first one, which is not identifying any of the underlying contributing factors to the injury. Now, there are times when there really were no predictive factors to the injury. Like, I've seen professional guys who have very, very efficient mechanics. They're really strong, they take care of themselves, they eat well, they sleep well. They're seemingly checking all of the boxes, and they still get injured simply because throwing hard is very, very inherently stressful. But this is rare. In most cases, if you do kind of get an evaluation, you look at, hey, was there a workload management issue? Did I throw in back-to-back-to-back games? Is this something where I pushed myself a little bit too quickly? I on-ramped a little bit too quickly? Maybe I threw way too many breaking balls one game. Like, is there anything I can pinpoint that might have been a contributing factor? So overuse, bad workload management, mechanical factors. Again, it's a little bit dicey to completely blame an injury on some subtle mechanical variable, but it is still something it's important to ask that question and ask, is there an egregious timing issue? Am I flying open really bad with my front side? Is there a really bad lead leg blocking issue? Am I utilizing my lower half properly? It's still worth it to ask these questions and see, hey, next time around, as I come through this rehab, what things can I be addressing differently this time around? Mistake number 3 is a big one that not a lot of people talk about, which is not addressing the scar. So in this case, I'm primarily talking to athletes who've had Tommy John or UCL Primary Repair, where they have a large scar here. Generally, the bigger the scar, the bigger the incision, the more focus you need to place on that scar, the more scar tissue is prone to be built up in that area. This would still apply to having any sort of elbow scope as well. However, it's a lot easier to deal with those small incision sites. So the key point here that I didn't initially learn until I had my first elbow surgery is the surgery actually does kind of permanently change the mechanics of the tissues around that joint. So you've cut through the tissue, cut through the fascia, it's healed over, it's now a different type of tissue, it's a scar tissue, and that can really create a lot of issues within the joint. So one common issue is that scar tissue can really tack down the ulnar nerve. You think about the tissues, you need the nerves and the fascia and the skin and the muscles. Everything needs to be able to be hydrated and slide over top of one another as you go through a throwing motion, wrist extension, wrist flexion. Everything needs to be supple, hydrated, and be able to slide. When you have a ton of scar tissue tacking down that nerve, then everything can't slide underneath it. And a lot of times athletes will get this nerve irritation somewhere along the lines of their rehab process, because as they go to throw, they're ending up tugging on that nerve. The nerve isn't sliding properly. So extremely important to actually address the scar. One simple test that I came up with, so again, take it for what it's worth, but I had some nerve issues coming back from my UCL Primary Repair, is that what I would do when it was giving me problems is if I pulled the skin where my bicep was, I pulled it up proximally, I would feel like it was kind of tearing under my scar. I could feel like a ton of tension under my scar and kind of uncomfortable, like I was tearing the tissue underneath there. So that's kind of the sensation I got when my scar was giving me issues, when I was kind of tacking down the nerve, when I was having some of these nerve symptoms in that first kind of 6 months of throwing after my UCL primary repair. As I began to address the scar, as I began to calm down, as I really loosened that up, just pulling the skin, there was no longer that sensation of kind of a tearing underneath the scar. Just moving the scar around and much more supple, much more pliable, and again, not tacked down to the tissue beneath that. So some tools with my therapist and I that were extremely helpful in addressing that, and that we've recommended for other athletes, is fascial abrasion technique. This was developed by, he's a former medical staff member for the Toronto Blue Jays. Fascial abrasion technique, or FAT, so you can check that out, ask your therapist about that. It's a little bit like Graston, but again, different in the actual application. It really was designed to address the fascial sliding mechanics of the tissue. And then dry needling. Normally dry needling is used for kind of trigger point type therapy, but there are actually techniques that I've had done to me that were really helpful that are used to free up the scar tissue. So you actually can needle the scar. And so I would ask your therapist about that as well. Number 4 is not moving enough early enough. This is something that I've kind of seen, and I've had actually 2 hip surgeries as well, so I've been through the surgery ringer a little bit. I've seen kind of this evolution in a lot of surgeons over the past 10 years or so, where it's now much more about, hey, get moving early. Do as much as you can, as early as you can, to regain that range of motion in whatever joint you had that surgery on. In the past, and especially with elbow surgeries, athletes were kind of told, like, just stay in a sling, don't even do anything, stay in bed, don't move it for 6 or 8 or 12 weeks. I've seen that go very wrong for athletes that we've worked with when they and I'll talk about that in a second, when they fully listen to that advice from certain surgeons and they just don't move it for 8, 12, 10 weeks. That's how you build up a ton of scar tissue and don't actually regain that range of motion. Most surgeons now, certainly all the top surgeons that I'm aware of, are now recommending getting it moving early within pain-free ranges. So there is a fine balance between doing too much too soon. So you shouldn't be doing, again, aggressive flexor training a week out of surgery, obviously, and not doing enough. So again, pain will be a signal to slow down in your rehab process. If you're having pain, you're probably doing too much. You shouldn't be forcing that range of motion week 1 after surgery through a painful block. But by the same token, if you're not nudging into these pain-free ranges, nudging into whatever your body is able to give you, that's extremely important when it comes to giving your body signals, giving the collagen fibers signals of how to lay down, the direction, the orientation for those fibers to lay down as your body begins to go through this healing process. So again, that's vital to regaining the range of motion, is moving it as much as you can, again, in conjunction with the recommendations from your therapist, through those pain-free ranges of motion. Again, not an elbow surgery example, but with a hip surgery example, I was on a stationary bike with 0 resistance the day after a hip labral surgery that I had. And again, this is one of the top hip surgeons, if not the top hip surgeon in the world. And so his whole thing is, if we're gonna prevent the scar tissue buildup from happening, we need to get it moving as soon as possible. We need to get nutrients flushed through that joint. We need to get it moving through pain-free ranges of motion. And again, that was a smaller range of motion, very low intensity, almost entirely passive to start. And again, the intensity builds over time. So again, to go back to this case study, this one athlete in particular that I'm thinking about, who I coached, he ended up having an elbow surgery, and he had to go back for a revision surgery because he had developed so much scar tissue and he just hadn't ever regained that range of motion back in his elbow, because again, he just spent that first 6 or 8 weeks, kept it in a sling. He didn't move it whatsoever. He thought he was just following what he was supposed to be doing. The problem is, again, the body is healing in line with the signals that you're giving it. So it's laying down these collagen fibers in certain direction, orientation, based on the signals you're giving it. If you're giving it a signal to just hang out here and not move it, it's just gonna lay those collagen fibers all over the place and just create a big mess of scar tissue. And so the surgeon that did his revision surgery said this was like the most scar tissue he'd ever seen in an elbow. And so again, that's given him issues for years and years after that initial surgery, simply because of those first 6 to 8 weeks. Mistake number 5 is not respecting the rehab sequence or skipping steps in the rehab sequence. So I'm sure you could talk to 10 different therapists. They give you 10 different answers, but they're all going to be pretty similar to this general sequence. And again, this goes for elbow surgery. This also goes for really any injury. So think about something as simple as like a mild flexor strain, where you might be back in 2 weeks pitching in games, to a full Tommy John surgery where it might be 18 months. This is generally the same sequence that you should go through. It's just going to be abbreviated if it's a more mild issue. First is minimize swelling and inflammation. The second would be regaining full range of motion. There is some overlap between the two. The third is regaining stability in that joint, and I added sagittal plane strength to that. The next is introduction to valgus stress. Could also be called the pseudo throwing phase. So you're not quite ready to expose your elbow to throwing related stresses yet, but you've regained strength. So this kind of acts as a bridge between those two. Then you get into the return to throwing program. You start exposing your arm to more and more stress, more and more valgus, and then finally return to competition. So as a general sequence of events, that's how we view it. The problem comes when athletes kind of merge some of these steps into the same step versus hitting these checkpoints along the way. So one issue that we see is some athletes will begin starting their throwing program before they've begun lifting at all, or before they've really regained any amount of strength. So I'm not so sure it's an amazing idea to begin throwing, let's say after a Tommy John surgery, when your grip strength is still that of, a 12-year-old girl. You're still gripping, 90 pounds, but you're starting to throw. It doesn't really make sense when you could spend another 3-4 weeks getting back into lifting, getting your strength to at least a baseline level. Now you've regained that stability, that sagittal plane strength. Your joint is more ready to accept some valgus loading. So I'm not sure that starting a throwing program before the strength is back makes a ton of sense. And for me, the conservative approach would be just lengthening that out a little bit and making sure the strength is pretty close to full before getting into the throwing program. The second thing that we see that I'm not so sure is if it's the best idea is skipping that pseudo throwing phase. So again, looking at, there's a period where you've regained full strength, but you're maybe not quite ready to get into full throwing. Even with catch play, even with light catch play, it's really tough to throw it under a certain intensity, under, let's say, 40 miles an hour. So what do you do to kind of bridge the gap between like 10 and 40 miles an hour? That's where the pseudo throwing phase comes in. So this could be, things like medicine ball wall taps with a 2-pound ball, with a basketball even to start. This could be internal rotation tosses into a trampoline. This could be a shoulder tube or a body blade, where you're, again, adding in a little bit of valgus loading, but you're not taking your arm into a full layback position at 40, 45, 50 miles an hour to start. So again, this is often skipped in more minor injuries. If it's a mild flexor strain, a lot of times it's like, hey, rest for 3 to 7 days, and then just throw a bullpen and then get right back in games. It's like, no, we need to still respect the sequence of events. We can still respect that there's going to be a swelling and inflammation process. Maybe that's 2-3 days. There's going to be a period to regain full range of motion, pain-free range of motion where you don't feel stiff. There's still going to be, let's make sure your grip strength is back, pain-free. Let's make sure you have stability in the joint. Get a couple lifts in, make sure you're good there. Again, pseudo throwing phase, where you're doing a couple days of that type of thing, making sure that doesn't re-aggravate the injury. Now we do an abbreviated throwing program. Now we start to build you back into competition. So really that same exact sequence no matter how big or small the elbow injury, tends to be the most conservative way to approach things. Mistake number 6 is using distance-based return to throwing programs only. So using distance-based programs, again, distance on its own is a very rough proxy for intensity and for the stress you're putting on your body and on your arm. But we kind of see that as, if you imagine like 2 photographs, 2 rehab plans. One is distance only, it just says 30 feet, 60 feet, 90 feet, 120 feet. And another has a ton more detail. You're really talking about a low resolution picture versus a high resolution picture of what you should really be doing. So the distance-based throwing programs that most surgeons give, they're a printout from 1980 on one page, and all it says is the distance and how many throws. That's a very low resolution plan. It will work for some athletes, it'll get them out of pain and back to competition, but I think we can do better. So can we add a little bit more resolution to that plan without deviating from the overall timeline, number of throws, etc., that is recommended? So the main problem with only using distance is that some guys will progress too slow, some guys will progress way too fast. So for example, if it says throw to 60 feet for 20 throws, well, those 20 throws could be at 90 miles an hour or they could be at 40 miles an hour. Now, obviously that's an extreme example, but I have seen athletes where in reality, like you tell them 50% and they're gunning it 88 miles an hour.
Super, that is not fucking 80%.
Or you tell them 60% and they're probably throwing at 90%. They aren't really very good at regulating their intensity, and they have no idea how much load they're actually putting on their arm when all they have is a distance guideline. So if you want to think about it in layers, as far as like this resolution analogy, distance is layer 1. We can still use distance as a gauge, like, hey, you're going to throw to 60 feet today. Layer 2 is radar feedback. So let's throw to 60 feet, but let's keep it within 50 to 55 miles per hour this week. Next week, 55 to 58 miles an hour. Next week, 58 to 61 miles an hour, using that as a general guideline. So hey, we still have a distance goal. Now we also have a radar goal, and we can make sure that athletes aren't making jumps that are way, way too aggressive throughout that progression. Layer 3 would be using something like a modus or pulse sensor, where you're actually monitoring the arm speed and the loading on the arm itself. So again, the goal is really to just incrementally increase the intensity on the arm. My general kind of guideline for the athletes that we work with is that actually should feel a little bit too easy at times. I'd rather that than feel like they're constantly pushing the limit of what they could just barely recover from by the next throwing session, and you're always towing the line between just too much. I'd rather it feel a little bit too easy, feel like they're maybe could be skipping forward a week or two in the progression, but we're not, we're holding them back. And it's like a horse where you're just trying to rein them in, you're reining them in, but it's easy. They feel fresh, they feel recovered, their arm feels good. There are no inhibitions, there are no compensations in their movement. The problem when you start to rush through a rehab program is that the body is really good at compensating, especially in more elite athletes. You're gonna find a way to get the ball to the target, but you might be adjusting your movement around a painful range of motion. And that's what we really need to watch out for, regardless of if it's an elbow injury, a shoulder injury, an ankle injury, is those compensations. So a general guideline for kind of most major elbow surgeries is about 2 to 3 miles an hour a week as a limit as far as a radar feedback guideline. So if one week you're throwing 65 to 67 miles an hour, you probably shouldn't be throwing 75 to 77 the very next week. Again, this is somewhat flexible depending on the injury, depending on the level of the athlete, but as a general guideline, 2 to 3 miles an hour per week is a pretty good goal. Mistake number 7 is not incorporating individualized drill work or footwork. In other words, simply following that one-page printout which says do all your throws from a shuffle step. It's like, well, what kind of shuffle step? There's a bunch of different ways to do a shuffle or a curl hop. Why is that specific footwork what's best for every single athlete that goes through that surgery? It doesn't really make sense if you kind of peel that back a little bit and try to examine, like, why does everyone have to do the exact same footwork? Like, our goal is to build back, to throw off the mound out of our delivery. So there's a million different ways to get to that same endpoint. Again, the goal here in the rehab progression is to incrementally increase stress and tolerance to that stress, and to regain efficient patterns on the mound that you can repeat. So whatever is going to accomplish that goal, is going to be what's most effective for that athlete. So that being said, it's not that some of our athletes don't do their rehab throws out of shuffle throws. That's an option, but some of those throws, a percentage of those throws might happen out of maybe an upper half drill or a lower half drill, or some throwing out of their actual delivery, something more specific to what they actually need to work on themselves mechanically versus just giving everybody the exact same footwork. So again, we need to try to avoid the cookie cutter model where possible. The cookie cutter model works on scale to a certain extent. Like if you're just gonna do 1,000 surgeries and you give out the same sheet to everybody, it's gonna work for a good percentage of those guys. But the guys with kind of more complex issues, or really if you look at each individual as n=1, could they be making better progress, more progress by the end of that rehab if you individualize things a little bit more? And I think the answer is yes. Mistake number 8 is thinking that you're almost game ready after your first pain-free bullpen. Now this is kind of a reminder to the athletes watching this, but it's actually more of a reminder to the coaches and therapists that kind of think that just because they see the athlete, he's pain-free, he's on the mound, this is amazing, you know, it's been a year, everyone's happy, great, let's pencil him in. Can he do a start 2 weeks from now? He's not, in most cases, an athlete is not as close to being game ready as we think just because he throws his first pain-free bullpen. So pain-free is not the same as game ready. Most coaches don't seem to understand this, especially at the higher levels where there's a ton of pressure from above to rush guys back to competition before they're actually fully ready to perform at the highest level. So you might be out of pain, but is your velocity back? Is your command back? Are you throwing off speed yet? Is your work capacity back? Or do you just throw a 15, 20 pitch bullpen and you think you're ready to actually go throw 2-3 innings in a couple weeks? We need to take all these variables into account. And again, I'd rather err on the side of being a little bit more conservative and really making sure that guy is game ready versus a guy who used to throw 95, now he's throwing 90 and we're just throwing him right in games, throwing him into the fire before his stuff is actually back. Just kind of some cautionary tales. I have seen guys get rushed back, thinking of TJ specifically in this case, to games 3 weeks after their first full speed bullpen. Not only were they not sharp, not ready, but this guy in particular, who I played with in pro ball, retore his UCL pretty quickly. So it's a matter of like, what would have happened if instead of trying to get him back 10 months out of TJ, we'd actually given him time to fully get through that process, and the organization had given him time to do so. I think there might have been a different outcome there. So ultimately, because there is a lot of pressure above, there's a lot of politics at play, athletic trainer in college or in professional baseball, they're getting pressured from above, from the head coach, from the coordinators to, hey, when is this guy going to be ready? When can we use him? When can we use him? When can we use him? But they're going to kind of skate towards a little bit more aggressive side in most cases. Ultimately, it's up to the player to look out for himself because the coach and the trainer are typically not going to be looking out for you. If things are going too fast, you need to be able to speak up and slow things down and explain, hey, I don't think I'm ready yet. I don't feel like I'm game ready. Can we do more than 2 bullpens? Can we do more than, a couple live at-bats before you throw me in games? So again, there's a million things we could talk about, but I'm going to end the video there. If you haven't already liked the video, go ahead and like that, give it a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. What other mistakes have you made in the elbow rehab process? Go ahead, drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you guys. If you're having any issues in your own career, or if you're a coach, you're having issues or have questions with your own coaching philosophy, go ahead and shoot us an email, contact@treadathletics.com, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.